The Singapore Grand Prix started off damp and only dried a little bit all the way through the race. Earlier in the weekend it was also fully wet. And we heard the commentators talk about something they called the Karting Line when describing what the drivers were doing in certain corners. I want to take a moment to explain in a little bit more detail what they mean by this and why drivers take a different approach to driving in the wet and position their car differently in damp and wet conditions. And don't worry, we'll also take a look at a couple of those on-track incidents and assign some blame as well. For those of you new to the channel, I've been a race driver for 20 years, winning the Red Bull kart fight and various national series, before becoming a high-performance driver coach at the world's leading race school for a decade. I was British F4 and F3 test driver, competed at the Race of Champions against current F1 drivers, and I'm a two-time champion of the Nürburgring Nordschleife. I now work as a test driver for a leading tyre manufacturer, driving on the limit every day at tracks all around the world. So first off, in the dry, we're all probably pretty happy with what a typical racing line is. You start at the outside, you then go to the apex on the inside, and then you let the car or the kart run to the outside again on the exit. And the idea here is that you're minimizing the angle of the steering, you're maximizing the minimum speed in the corner, and you can basically get through that corner in the shortest time possible. But when we get to wet or damp conditions, you start to see that typical line change slightly. Drivers don't necessarily use that same outside-inside-outside line, and there are reasons for this. But before we talk about why a Formula 1 car does this, let's take a look at a kart, since we're talking about the karting line. Now, if you ever watch a wet kart race, you'll see that this difference in line between dry and wet conditions is exaggerated, and there's a very good reason for this. All karts have a fixed rear axle. So what that means is there's a solid bar that joins the two rear wheels. Now this is completely fine until you want to turn a corner and the outside wheel needs to rotate more times than the inside wheel because it's travelling further. Now in a car, the differential sorts this out and allows this to happen. But in a kart, there are only two ways that that thing is going to be able to rotate and turn through a corner. The first of these is sliding. If the rear end is sliding, it doesn't matter that one wheel would normally need to turn further than the other, because it's not actually gripping the floor, so it actually makes no difference. Effectively, the outside tyre can rotate just as many times as it needs to follow that longer path, and the inside wheel is just sliding across the surface anyway. But we know that sliding is slower. We want to try and avoid sliding at all costs because it means you're not moving forwards as quickly. In general, any significant slide is a time loss. So there's another way that a car rotates through a corner, and that's by very deliberately lifting the inside wheel off of the floor. This might come as a surprise to some people, but karts are designed with steering geometry, which actually allows them to lean over on the front, which picks up the inside rear wheel on the opposing corner, taking it off the ground and allowing it to rotate as many times as it needs to, unopposed. This removes the need for a differential, and it allows the kart to get through corners quickly. But the problem comes when there's not enough front grip anymore to dig in and allow that inside wheel to pick up. What then happens is massive understeer. And so if a kart takes a normal racing line in the wet, it just wants to go straight on. If you've ever tried to maneuver a go-kart in a pit lane, it's very, very difficult to push them around because that fixed rear axle effectively makes the kart want to go straight until one of the wheels comes off the floor. So here's our problem. In the wet, there's not enough grip to make that happen. So what do the drivers do? The kart drivers go around the very outside of the corner because that's where there is more grip and they have to turn the wheel less. So that understeer they'd be picking up as a result of the inside wheel struggling to lift isn't as much of a problem. Now we all know Formula 1 cars don't need to lift an inside rear wheel to get around a corner, but they do like more grip. So let's take a look at the reasons why that part of the track has more grip and why these alternative lines also work better for Formula 1 cars in the wet conditions. So we all know that more tyre touching the track equals more grip, and that's why slick tyres have no grooves, so they've got the maximum surface area touching the track. But the moment you introduce moisture into the equation, things become a little bit more complicated. The fact that those tyres don't have grooves means that there's nowhere for that water to go, and so it sits as a film between the tyre and the track surface, which then causes a lack of grip. Now this same thing is true of the surface itself. In the dry, the best place to be is generally the rubbered in, smooth, polished part of the track that allows the tyre to sit nice and flat on the surface with maximum surface area. But in the wet, the opposite is true, because a smooth, rubbered in surface means there's even less opportunity for water to dissipate, and so it's even more likely to sit as that film between the tyre and the track. On top of this, the part of the track that's been driven over more, i.e. the normal racing line, becomes polished. The millions of small stones that make up the asphalt surface become smooth through constant use, and this exacerbates this same problem. Therefore, the drivers naturally look for areas of the track that are used less often, that provide that extra grip that they're looking for, and that tends to be around the outside off the racing line. The water drains away more easily and the surface is rougher, allowing those tyres to bite. Now, we saw a great example of this effect off the start line at the Singapore Grand Prix last weekend, where the cars on the left-hand side of the grid, off the racing line, seem to all get better starts than those on the right-hand side. Perez overtook Leclerc for first place, and Sainz overtook Hamilton for third place, with those on the normal racing line seemingly scrabbling for grip as they tried to get away from their start boxes. For another clear example, take a look at this pole position lap in Formula 2 from Callum Ilott from the 2019 season at a very wet Hungaroring, and notice how he seems to always be off the racing line and taking a longer distance round each corner, which would ordinarily be a huge disadvantage. But in these conditions, that's where he found the grip, because of all of the factors we've just spoken about earlier. Now, interestingly, at Singapore, we didn't really see this happening very often, and there's a few good reasons why at a street circuit such as this, the wet line is much less effective and much less used. And the first of those is pretty obvious. There are barriers on the outside. You can't really go around the outside very easily without clattering into a wall, and we saw that happen with a couple of drivers. Alex Albon went slightly offline and went straight into the barrier at low speed. But also, look at the kind of corners we've got here. They tend to almost exclusively be 90-degree right-angle corners, so there's no constant radius. There isn't really an outside to follow. The geometry of the corners is just such that there isn't really an outside you can take. There's only really one line through a lot of these corners, which is why the racing line tended to look a little bit more like a standard dry line. You did see drivers, particularly Verstappen, hunting for grip offline on the exits of some of the corners. So out of turn 3, for example, you'd often see Verstappen slightly further to the left than other drivers because he was looking for that greater purchase, that greater traction away from the corner on a slightly rougher, less rubbered-in surface. So it was happening to some degree. But by and large, we didn't see a lot of typical wet lines at this track. The third reason we didn't is because this isn't a normal racetrack. This isn't used throughout the year, it's public roads. So there is no real polished line, because the line that road cars are taking through most of the year is obviously totally different to what the Formula 1 cars do. So this karting line effect is much more noticeable on tracks that are used throughout the year and have that polished racing line. So that's probably enough racing theory for the moment. So let's take a look at a couple of the incidents that happened during the race. Let's start off with Zhou Guanyu and Nicholas Latifi. So as the drivers exit turn 3, come through turn 4 and into turn 5 in the first sector, Zhou gets a better run than Latifi and starts to pull alongside him on his left-hand side. Latifi apparently has no idea he's there. Either he just couldn't see him in the mirrors or he had too much attention focused further up the track. But whatever the reason, Latifi very clearly wandered across the track into Zhou, put him in the barrier and took them both out of the race. Latifi suffered a puncture and left rear suspension damage, and Zhou was out on the spot also with suspension damage. This one doesn't need a lot of reviewing. This one is Latifi's fault and it's a slam dunk. You have to stop moving across the track when you reach the other car, and he went further than that and pushed Zhou into the barriers. You have to stop moving across when you reach another car, and he didn't and caused a crash. So that one's easy. So next, let's look at George Russell overtaking Mick Schumacher. Now this one's slightly more complicated and I'll explain why. Russell claimed at the time that he'd left more than enough room for Schumacher. Now that is partly true, but the room he'd left him was on the other side of Schumacher's car, which is a space that Schumacher had no obligation to move into. This is something I really take issue with, and it's an argument several drivers have used over the last year, that they've left room for another car, but the room that they're referring to is on the other side of that car. This is a real red herring because drivers are not obliged to move into the space that you want them to. The onus is on you to not continue moving towards them once you reach the edge of their car. Russell was very clearly moving to the right-hand side while Schumacher was driving pretty straight towards turn 1, and Russell continued to move right towards him even when he reached Schumacher's car, eventually bouncing off him, causing himself a puncture and also damaging Schumacher's car. The argument that Schumacher had room to move into and therefore Russell left him space is just a misinterpretation of what that rule means. Leaving a driver space means leaving them room to exist, and if they're existing in a position on the track, that's the space you have to leave them. If both drivers were consenting to a particular line, say for example Schumacher and Russell were both moving towards the right-hand side of the track at a similar rate, and then Schumacher suddenly stopped and began to go straight, Russell would have a much better argument because there would have been a clear consent for both cars to follow an agreed trajectory. But in this case, there was none of that agreement. Schumacher was pretty much heading straight towards turn 1, albeit with a very slight drift to the left, and Russell was very clearly moving right towards Schumacher. And so I'd put this one almost fully on Russell, and I'm sure once he looked at the replays afterwards, he'd probably agree with that assessment. Now, although there were plenty of other incidents in this race, we had Hamilton going straight on into the barriers, we had Verstappen hitting a bump and locking up and also going straight on. None of them are particularly exciting to look at, and the reasons for them are pretty obvious, so I think we're going to leave it there for this race and look ahead to the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and if you agree with me or disagree with me about anything I've said in this video, please leave a comment below and let's get the discussion going. I'll see you again after the Japanese Grand Prix next week, but until then, thanks for watching.